So welcome back to Over the Pond. We're actually doing kind of a little special follow-up to our first episode, which was about proactive versus reactive safeguarding, because since our last discussion, there's actually been new guidance that have come out from the US and from the UK, which is exciting. How exciting the guidance is or how helpful it is, we'll get into soon. But we thought it would be good to reflect on some of the new information and things that have changed. So, hey, Maggie, how are you?
Hi, Kat. I'm doing well. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thank you.
You excited to talk about all things guidance? And
yes, let's dive into it. So, tell me first of all, what is the new documentation that you've got then?
So the interesting thing is it's new, but yet also not new, which is funny. It's one of those, it's going to an effect later, but we know about it now. So there's kind of two parts to it. One of them is just in the state of California, and it's the California Age-Appropriate Design Code Act. And it's less about what schools do and more about the actual ed tech vendors, the creators of platforms, social media, what they're going to be forced to do, or they're going to not enforced in a good way, I think. We'll get into that. What they're going to have to do, but it relates to just the population in California. However, it seems to be influencing in a very good way legislation that will then hopefully come out eventually for the U.S. as a whole, for kind of following that same guideline. So the CA California Age Appropriate Design Code Act, we'll just call it the Design Code to make it easier to talk about. Those are always massive names. It was passed back in September of last year, but it doesn't go into effect until next year. But essentially, it looks at the way that platforms that children engage with, whether it's social media, whether it's ed tech, anything they're going to be engaging with online, how they're able to disseminate content to the students. So we know like social media has those fancy algorithms, and instead of seeing your friends, you see all diet culture or all fashion or all things related to X, Y, and Z based off of the things you've liked or interacted with before. So eventually all you see is just those things. And there have been a lot of studies about how negatively that impacts children, because then they're constantly being barraged with it and they can't get around it. They don't know what to do. So
yeah, of course.
Now it's actually regulating that they default to a lot of standards that the UK actually follows along with, which is instead of opting out, it's an opt-in first. So the user has to choose if they want to opt into certain things like those algorithms or like certain
which I think makes total sense, even like for everyone, not just children but adults and things. Like, generally I'm annoyed if I have to opt out of everything rather than choosing what to opt into,
I agree. And I mean, I don't think it's that. And of course, with kids, what bothers me is at certain ages, they're not knowing what they're opting into. So it could be
they're probably not even able to read some of it.
So it's like, just click yes to keep going forward. And you're like, no, don't do that. So I don't know how they're going to make that work that makes it appropriate for kids to know this is what you're signing up for. But at least it's not going to be tracking data or things until they've opted into it, which is really good. So, and this kind of relates a lot to the UK Children's Code, which for the people in the US, if you want to explain kind of a little bit what that is, that'll help to connect the dots as to how they kind of match up together a little bit.
Yeah, so really it's to cover, so things like apps, games, any kind of connected toys and devices and new services, and making sure that things are age appropriate. Any kind of information that can be accessed by children effectively is covered within that, which is really good. So it's our kind of UK and non-UK based companies as well, if they're operating here. And there's kind of different things that have to conform with. So they need to make it clear what personal data is being mapped. They have to check the age of people that visit their websites or download apps or play the games. And I guess the idea with that is that when it checks the age, it then gives the appropriate information to the user based on their age. So something in a way they can understand, or it says, actually, you shouldn't be using this, but how they kind of word that, I don't know. It would be quite interesting to see what happens based on the age and how apps change. That'd be quite a cool experiment. But it should switch off geolocation services as well. It shouldn't be tracking location of children, and there shouldn't be those kind of nudging bits to get more personal data, like you'll often see in things like, oh yeah, why don't you add your birthday? Why don't you add this to your profile? Don't worry, it's private, yeah, that high level of privacy is the default. So it's that opting in rather than opting out, basically, like you said before. So yeah, so it is really useful to have, and it's kind of crazy that it's not something that's been around since all this tech kind of got into the hands of kids. But yeah, I'm really glad to see that there are some links in the US, because I do think the more protection that we have for children with stuff like this, the better. And also the more kind of, the more, what's the word I'm looking for? The more accountability for companies, because I think the problem is that a lot of pressure gets put on schools and parents, but actually there's a lot that the companies could be doing to improve their transparency and to make schools and parents' lives a lot easier.
Oh, 100%. And actually, I was just thinking that because the funny thing is, for a while now, it's the onus has been on schools to, in their vetting process, go through and kind of ask the questions of what data do you share, what what is or isn't there, and so it's their responsibility. If they not accidentally, but they purchase something or use something that then potentially puts students at risk, they're the ones that take the blame for it. When realistically, it's the company, it's the vendors, it's people making them that are putting the kids at risk. And to find all that and figure out how it's going to impact them, we don't really know. So I'm excited by that, because I know a lot of schools go through a very arduous process of vetting everything and testing it and then doing all this stuff. And so if they know that companies have to comply with something, that they have to legally do that, it'll take that pressure off of them to tick those boxes and focus on, well, how will this positive impact learning? How's this going to impact the curriculum? How's the student, and as opposed to, do I need to worry about my kids going on this and potentially being bullied or potentially having being exposed to content they shouldn't be receiving? So
because there is a lot kind of within the document that I've been reading as well about how schools do have the responsibility to ensure that things are safe for use. But what's nice is that in this document, they've started to kind of suggest things that would indicate that. So things like, are they a member of the Internet Watch Foundation? They should be signed up to the Counterterrorism Internet Referral List. This is for anything that's like filtering and monitoring. They should block access to illegal content such as child sex abuse material. And things like, they need to ensure that their software is still supported. They need to have updated security certificates, stuff like that. So it is kind of giving some information to schools of what to look for. And I think hopefully this guidance as well will push back to the ed companies a bit more about being very clear of what they share with their customers. And I think it might inform the sort of questions that staff ask them as well, which I think would be really good. I think it will open up a lot of discussions to make sure it is right for them.
Yeah, I'm really hoping we get a lot more guidance. And it's hard because it's like there's guidance, but of course, if it's guidance, you don't have to follow it. It's only if it's law that you actually have to follow it. And of course, it's hard to legislate everything, and you don't want to be over legislated. But they're working right now on, nationally, KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act. It was introduced very early in 2022, and it is still moving through the process of actually going through all the ups and downs and kinks and stuff that is the U.S. government and our lovely process of legislature. So who knows when it'll actually get passed, but it has a similar kind of philosophy to what they're doing in California, which already passed and will go obviously into effect in 2024, which is it requires, now they're being more specific about social media platforms providing minors with options to protect their rights and their information, disable features that shouldn't actually be there, and opt out of the algorithm recommendations. So ways to get out of that and what that looks like. And I've heard suggestions about things like, you can choose a timeline based where it'll just show you the most recent things by time. Because I know when I get on like Instagram or Facebook, it's not by time, it's by what they think is most popular, relevant to me. And then I'm missing, I don't see my friends' pictures, I don't see what they do, and heaven forbid you like one thing, next thing you know, you're getting 80 puppy videos, which is not a bad thing. 80 puppy videos in your feed, and I'm like,
that would be great.
My friend's vacation.
It's so true. The amount of adverts you get for things where you bought one thing, because they're obviously tracking your shopping data, but you bought one thing one time many months ago, and then the same thing just pops up all the time, and it's bonkers.
It's just insane. And the number of times, and of course how interconnected it is and everything too. We can obviously talk about that, but and even as adults, we're still learning about what that looks like and realizing how our behavior online influences what they're doing to us, and then what they're doing, that's how it influences us. Can you imagine a kid who's, their brains are not fully developed, they're still trying to figure things out, they're trusting of adults, they're trusting of these platforms in front of them, not realizing that content is being positioned to them based off of certain things, and it's preventing them from really being exposed to not bad things, obviously, but a wider circle of things, because it's so focused on stay in your bubble, do the thing. We know you like this, and if you see more of it, you'll buy the thing, you'll do the thing. And I think it's ridiculous for kids, because why are you pushing kids to buy stuff? I will never know. Like, they're young. Why are you advertising to them, to buy something? I mean, the 8-year-old shouldn't be seeing that. 12-year-old shouldn't be seeing that. No.
And it's all just a way to get their parents, I guess. They want them to start saying to their parents, oh, buy this for me, get this for me. It's just...
That's what TV commercials are for. You know what? Then let them watch something and they can see it. But no one watches TV anymore. They watch like streaming services, and then they don't get ads.
That's true. Then they miss the adverts.
They're like, oh no. So, but this is the KOSA one's really nice, because it's actually been endorsed by Common Sense Media, the American Compass Internet Accountability Project, Digital really Progress. Like, a lot of different organizations are all backing it, which is really good to see. It's just taking so long to get through that by the time it does then goes into effect, a lot of things can happen. A whole generation of kids could be impacted. So
absolutely. And then there might be revisions to it as well, and changes, and absolutely. So of ours, we've got it's the Meeting Digital and Technology Standards in Schools and Colleges that came out at the end of last month. And it's funny because it says it's guidance, but I think it's like there are parts of it that are very much like, these are standards that you should already be meeting, or you should be meeting soon. So it's like not so much law, but it's like you better get on with this.
Like, no one's going to come for you, but we will come for you.
Pretty much like we're going to be checking for this. So, like whenever a school's getting inspected or anything like that, or reviewed or whatever, this is what they're going to be looking to check they've done these things. So especially as there is a lot. So I was looking through, and there's so much where they're expecting schools to monitor and log things, like keeping track of things like on your firewall, what you've blocked and why, and what you've allowed and why, and your risk assessments, and there's so much documentation on schools, which I think in some ways is good, because obviously it's important to keep track of all this stuff, but also I feel like it'd be a massive headache for schools, especially when you've got ones that have an IT provider that's in like 1 day a week, keeping a track of all these things. So it'd be really interesting to see kind of how schools shift in what they want from software. So, what kind of things are they looking for the software to do for them? Like, what kind of things do they want logged? What kind of things are they hoping to be able to record? And kind of like that sort of thing, I think would be quite interesting. And there's a lot in here as well about a push to multi-factor authentication, which is interesting. Because I know when I was teaching, it was you just had your username and password, and you got prompted to change it every few months or something. That was about it. So they're kind of moving into that space, and there's quite a few bits in there where it's interesting. So some things where they're like, oh, you should already be doing this as a school, and then others where it's like, you should be doing this as soon as possible. And with the MFA, that's what they've kind of said, they want it as soon as possible, and they want to see how it works. But what I did appreciate that they included when talking about how they authenticate data is they did look at like SEN pupils and younger pupils, because there are obviously a lot of instances where pupils aren't really going to be able to provide different passwords. So it's finding different ways to authenticate, and they did link to some other sites and things that had recommendations for that. And it's about being sensible about, well, what data is being accessed? Do they even need to access that data? Is this something that actually needs to be locked down? So that's really useful. But it is a shame that although they talked about the pupils with that, they didn't think about staff. So staff with like kind of neurodiversity or special educational needs, what's their expectation when it comes to multi-factor authentication? How are we going to make sure that they're able to access things securely but accessibly? So that's something I think got overlooked, although I'm not that surprised. Unfortunately, so it is something that needs a bit more kind of looking into. It was interesting.
Well, that's a good point too, that we I love that they're making accommodation for students, which is really great. And also looking at different student populations, but you're right. Like you have to consider the population of adults as well. And you can't just assume that one flat policy will apply to everyone or work for everybody, because that you do need to have those accommodations or things. And hopefully because it's not legislation and because it's not requirement, it's more of a guidance that schools can take it and kind of come up with in our environment, this works for you, this works for you, this is, the bare minimum, we do this for everybody, and then go from there, and they can kind of make it work too. So I tend to find that the schools that are more open to hiring staff who are like neurodivergent or on the spectrum, things along those lines too, that they then take that accommodation into account more so than schools that are used to, hiring staff that don't fall into those categories, or at least they're not recognizing the staff that are falling into those categories. And that's another shift that has to happen as well too on that side. But
yeah, absolutely. So there is a huge shift as well in the importance of filtering and monitoring, which I think is interesting. It's something that they kind of said in here that schools should already have a system in place for that. But they've really bumped it up with its whole own section and like lots of information about like what the provider should be doing for you, how this links into your various different like acceptable use policies and your data protection, blah, blah, blah. So that's good, because I do think it's so important that it's not just the filtering. I think a lot of schools have filtering, a lot of schools have firewalls. It's the monitoring, it's those keywords, it's those safeguarding risks and things. So I think seeing some of that stuff mentioned was a really nice thing to see, that they want kind of more tracking of what people are doing online and where it could be a problem, and making sure that the relevant people are involved. So the designated safeguarding lead is aware of these sort of things as well.
I think that's a good point. And I think that like over here too, with like SIPA and other things we have, every school has to have a filter, your DNS filters, you've got it's blocking and stopping things that it can. And of course, some things get through and they do their best to kind of find them. But the filtering, to some extent, a lot of the filtering just blocks it and doesn't allow it to actually go through, but it's not giving them a full picture of, well, what was being searched for that led to that coming up there. Because you'd love to know if a student hit one thing. It reminds me of, many, many years ago when I first started teaching, but back when people weren't afraid of stuff on the internet and you didn't really know it was out there, and you Jimmy in 4th grade suddenly types in boobs, and next thing you know, all these pictures pop up and you're like, whatever. And of course, Jimmy's not looking at it maliciously. He's a 4th grader who heard someone talk about it and wants to know, and then all these things pop up, and it's like, it'd be good to know then the more of the history of what actually was searched for, what they're looking for, that context. A lot of the things obviously we do like at NetSupport with like NetSupport DNA and Classroom Cloud, of less about the actual blocking and more about the history of what gets you to that point, what words were triggered, what was the activity around it, what websites were they clicking on or going to understand the journey so that you can better block. Because a lot of times when you get to here, here's blocked, but here and here aren't. And you really don't want them in A and B before they get to C. You want them nowhere near there, but you don't know that because those aren't triggering anything. But if you have more information, then you're able to identify those things and stop the path from getting too close.
It did mention as well that staff need to kind of be aware of and reporting things where there's kind of like sort of like little mistypings or little kind of abbreviations or bits of slang where it's allowing them to get around things and get access to things that they shouldn't. And that's why I think things like that software that we have would be really useful, because obviously you can put in your own terms, you can kind of, track the activity around it and see, oh, wait, no, they've typed in this actually. And that kind of is another word for this that we've not been tracking. Or so, yeah, I think that would be really useful to get a proper picture of what's happening. And like you say, kind of the build up to it as well.
Yeah. And it's just, there's just so many things that, again, it's like as a teacher, as an administrator, it's so hard to keep track of everything. And to be responsible for your kids' online lives while they're there. And if they're taking a school device home, is the device being protected and what regulations are in there? Ultimately, there's a lot that's going to be on top of us. I do love that they're providing more guidance about it, but I think a lot of it comes back to what we started talking about at the beginning, which is more of the onus on the vendors, the people who are providing the tools, the things. On the internet is the internet. There's no one out there, I think, monitoring, overarching the internet. I guess I could go after Google or Firefox or something. But, when it comes to any sort of programs they could be on, at least in those, we should be secure enough knowing that when my kid gets on this app or they open up this tool, they're not going to be presented with content they shouldn't be. They're not going to be given misinformation or guided the wrong way. And I think that's a huge start of expecting tech to hold themselves to higher standards, of being able to prove that they've done it, so that it doesn't force the educators to have to do more policing, not just of what the students are looking at, but what tools they're on, because that's just way too much for anyone to have to be in charge of or responsible for.
Yeah. And I think there's an area where actually these companies can really help as well, which is around staff training. Because they've mentioned within this document they want all staff, which is a nice shift as well, saying all staff, not just like teaching staff or head teachers, or to have cybersecurity training. And linked within that, they want all staff to really have the training of all the different software that they're using and understand all of that properly as well. So I think that's where they could kind of really support. Because I think sometimes when schools are asked to do that kind of training, it is like, it's the same basic information about being safe online and this and that. And I think there are so many areas to cover that where they kind of need someone external to be able to really give them that support. It's a bit more tailored.
Does your like Office of Education, I remember what it's called. Like we have our Office of Education Technology, which is part of the Department of Education, but like ours will often partner with things like Common Sense Media or other digital support things to create curriculum or content that's accessible that then teaches the students, teaches the teachers about these certain things. Do you have anybody kind of nationally who's creating PD or any sort of things that can be used for that purpose?
There are a lot of kind of like websites and kind of organizations that are recommended. So that's kind of the best thing that they've got at the moment, is they've got various different organizations they recommend that have these good standards, or so there is some support there, but I think it would be beneficial for the companies themselves working with the schools to be a little bit more involved,
just collectively,
especially when it's like specific to the products. Because I think it's often that some of the staff will get missed. So, you know, like we talked about before, it's the admin staff, it's the teaching assistants, it's the lunchtime supervisors, they kind of get excluded from these conversations. And actually it's good to kind of have everyone involved, really.
I agree. We were at an event, the Technology and Education event on Monday, and we got to talk to a principal, which I didn't realize that's what she was at the time, but she was asking questions about, you know, if a teacher is out, like if teachers out of a classroom, and we have a sub coming in, then how do we make sure that we can, you know, the kids are still using what they're using and things like that. We were talking about our product specifically, but it was very interesting because then when I realized she's a principal, she was talking about her being able to access and utilize these tools. And of course, you know, a lot of times they're designed for the teachers and something there, but she wanted to do it from an admin side to help support when her teachers are out of the class. And I think a lot of ed tech companies, you're right, they do forget about that fact that especially in smaller schools, you know, where you have people wearing multiple hats, you have principals stepping in, subbing in classrooms when they don't have enough subs, or you have them helping to moderate the class or at least manage it when the sub comes in, because a lot of times the subs aren't trained teachers. They're just there basically like, you know, making sure the work gets passed out and done, but then the kids take advantage and things are going on. So I think that there's a lot to be said for providing accessible professional development around these kind of things, not just for, like you said, teachers, but also for admins. And then also having a resource that if someone's going to come on board and be a sub, you know, a substitute in your school or in your district or in your trust, that they be able to access that and honestly be required to complete that, you know, whether they watch at home and they answer some questions, where they understand, they know, so that they are also trained for knowing the general gist of the policies and what they mean and what to look out for. Because that could be the one day the teacher's gone, that a student gives some sort of indication of something happening or accessing something that the person's not trained to see, and you miss out on that opportunity to intervene and to help. And of course, you can't train everybody on everything, but if you're going to be working in schools, I think it'd be really nice to see support for everybody involved, not just on one group or one subgroup of people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Makes complete sense. One thing I thought was kind of interesting as well, though, was said that schools need to have various different cyber attack plans. They have to have like their general plans for all kinds of different things in place. But they also need to test and review these regularly. And I'm just curious how they're testing, like how are they going to be testing? And also with the reviewing, it said maybe kind of termly was the rough suggestion, but like how do they review them and how do they test them? That I find quite interesting. And I feel like there is, again, I think there's too much kind of accountability on the schools. And yes, there are things they should be accountable for, but they're kind of being expected to do all these tasks. And it actually mentions throughout the document, oh, your your IT service provider might be someone external. And I was thinking they probably would need to be to do all this stuff.
For testing this and making sure. I mean, goodness, it's not like a fire drill where you can have the kids just like, okay, guys, go to the emergency exits. Let's see how fast this goes.
I'm not sure about. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's a lot simpler than it sounds when they're saying about testing and reviewing. But I'm just curious what they're expecting from schools to have done. Like, are they going, oh yes, we got X teacher to go online and like try and hack into the system and see what happened. Like, it's
are they able to break in? So
I don't know.
Well, what's interesting, I think in the U.S. there is some good progressiveness on this because it generally goes towards the vendors to be responsible for. So most states have, and other states have kind of piggybacked or adopted education laws that in order to work with the school district, the vendor has to actually sign off on and agree to, you will have a plan in place. So if some sort of attack happens on the system as a whole, that's on you as the vendor providing it. And then how are you going to mitigate it? How are you going to let us know what data was compromised? How are you going to inform us? And then the school's responsibility is then to say, okay, if something happens to one of the tools we use, this is how we'll disseminate the information to parents about what happens. And I think that's a good example of working in tandem, of basically saying, I know that I can't protect this thing that's housed outside of me. It's in the cloud. It's in the servers, third-party providers. There's nothing I can really do about that. I'm going to choose a provider that I have vetted and I trust has safeguards in place, but has also agreed to make sure that I'm made aware as soon as possible so that I can inform people who need to know that data has potentially been compromised. So I think you have that good process in place, and you have to have those things. And as legalized as it is with signing off on stuff and everyone's names and everything, it keeps people in check. It forces them to make sure that they're.
And I do think there are definitely elements of that within like companies' contracts with schools and things. But it is, it's how much and how a kind of schools receiving those. Are they aware of all the different elements? So I think this was more referring to if it was kind of a data lake within the school rather than within, like, say it was like a software provider or whatever and it was their data lake. But it's still kind of, I'm still not sure how they're meant to test. That's the bit I'm unclear on, is the testing of, there's a few kind of elements it mentions like that in there, testing this and testing that. And it's, I'd be interested to kind of find out a bit more about that.
And I would guess then that if they're talking about testing it, it's like you talked about earlier, like the multi-factor authentication. It's the, could a student sit down on a teacher's computer and access information and be able to actually get in there and grab things, or could a parent come or something, do something to get into the school system? And I don't know how much zero trust architecture or zero trust security, if that has kind of permeated over there a lot, if that terminology comes up, but we're seeing a lot more guidance over here related to schools with zero trust, which for anyone watching who doesn't know, zero trust means you trust no one and you assume that nothing is safe. Even if you have firewalls and things, you don't assume that just because you've crossed through. Basically, the old mentality was the moat mentality of, okay, you get across the moat and now you have access to everything because clearly you made it across the moat, so you're safe. And the new mentality is, no, you get across the moat and now there's like mazes to go through and things. And it sounds complicated, but it basically just means that there's multiple layers of protection. So just because you're in here doesn't mean you can get in here or get in here. And I feel like that's really important for schools because funny thing is, as they train students and teachers about this and they make them go through those hoops, it becomes normalized. And so when those students become adults and they're accessing technology and they're working, they're becoming developers themselves, whatever they're doing, they're keeping that mind frame that in the forefront of their head, saying, okay, make sure I set up multiple passwords, make sure I don't just have one password for everything, make sure I don't just log in and then never log out of my systems. Like you're teaching them good digital citizenship behavior in terms of protecting themselves online. And it's a shame that it took this long to get there. But it is the one case where I like the trust no one, like the stranger danger. I think it's actually really helpful for that.
I think they are definitely honing in on that with the whole like multi-factor authentication, for example, the big kind of push on that. It's the kind of where you can't just use the password and log in. Like you need to be lots of ways to authorize it's you. And also there was a lot in there as well about like not doing blanket permissions, like being really clear on what staff need to access, what they need to be able to do, and really making sure that's segmented as well, which I think is a key thing that might have been neglected in some instances. So that would be really useful, I think, as well. And, having to have a higher level of authentication for the most sensitive data, all that kind of thing. So those sorts of things I think do make a lot of sense for schools and will be really good for them. Initially, setting up some of it might present some headaches, like it always does. But
your teacher calling the front office, I can't log into this thing because you
can't get into
it. I just need the grade
the wrong fingerprint or something. I don't know.
Oh my god, I use my thumb instead of my finger, but
yep.
But I do think it's like, I think it's a good step forward, and it is great because you don't. And it's awful to think about, but all these hacks that happen on companies and things that go on there, that school data is just as lucrative for some people as it is, because then they get the kids' data, they get this information, they can go out and they can do all sorts of things with, like in the US, we have social security numbers, we have all sorts of identifiers that you have from birth, that if someone gets a hold of them, they can open bank accounts in your name, they can open credit cards, they can do all these things for even the kid is, 16, 17, or even younger, they can still do things with them. So schools are going to become targets for these type of things. And usually it's people holding them for ransom and saying, oh, well, we're taking all your data and we want you to pay $3 million, which who thinks a school has $3 million? I mean, honestly, I don't know, but they think people are going to pay it. So it's just kind of, it's good now to protect, because you just never know what's going to happen. And you want to make sure that everything is safe and that kids aren't exposed to something on your watch ultimately.
Yeah, so I think that kind of covers most of everything on my side. What about you, Maggie? Was there anything kind of left of your documentation?
No, that really is pretty much all the new exciting things happening over in the US. It's nice to see that there's a lot of similarity in the thought process of what's going on, although obviously different approaches in some cases.
Yeah.
But hopefully we can have more of a unified approach, because I think there's a lot we can get from both sides that would be really helpful and beneficial to ultimately just the schools, creating a better environment for kids and making it less stressful for schools and admin as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think if companies are kind of held to the same standards across different places, that's quite useful, rather than there being like different rules and laws and codes of conduct for different kind of places. And same with schools as well. If there is some kind of consistency for something as important as cybersecurity, you kind of benefit everyone, really.
I agree. So it'd be nice to have a nice and easy, but hey, if it's going to not be nice and easy, at least the onus is on the people who are making the solutions, hopefully, and less so on the teachers who have to actually manage the classroom and deal with everything. Because the less stress we can put on teachers and administrators, the happier everybody is, I think.
Yes, definitely. Let's move towards that as much as possible. All right. Well, thanks for chatting with me today, Maggie.
Of course, Kat. I love to talk to you anytime, and I'll see you again soon for another sesh of Over the Pond.
Yeah. I wonder what we'll talk about next. Bye for now.
Bye for now.